Hello everyone, welcome to the latest Aura online event. It's great to have your company this morning. What a fine way to kickstart the day. Or for anyone who's already put in a shift, and I'm sure many of you have, what a super way to re-energize and turn attention away from the myriad demands that are placed upon you. You're listening to Tom Kerr, a treasurer and event organizer at Aura. Today's event title is Sci Fi for Marketers, How Systems-Based Thinking Can Lead to Better Foresight. What a good title. It immediately grabbed my attention when it first landed in my inbox, I have to say. Our speaker this morning is Stefan Schafer. He is a director of the research planning and strategy consultancy Incite. Inspiration, creativity, commercial savvy, and consumer insights are the factors that drive long-term success for any organization. Incite believes that the human factors such as inspiration and creativity are just as important as commercial savvy and consumer insight. They connect all of these elements to help clients unlock opportunities and grow their business. So Stefan has pulled out a lovely quote from Isaac Asimov, which reads, "It is easy to predict an automobile in 1880. It is very hard to predict a traffic problem." Asimov is making the point that real foresight means looking beyond the obvious consequences of what we see happening in the world. Instead, so-called system-based thinking encourages us to keep asking, and then what? To uncover the unobvious, God, if such a word exists, consequences, or as it is more commonly put these days, the unexpected consequences. Stefan will share examples of unexpected winners and losers and use system-based thinking to help explain why they won or why they lost. He will also suggest a way for teams to apply system-based thinking to their own situation, your own situation, and get a little better at seeing the future. So the presentation is going to last for about 20 minutes, after which there will be a 10-minute Q&A session as per the norm. Put your questions into the box at the bottom of your screen. We'll ask Stefan to respond to them at the end of the presentation. So grab a coffee, wriggle your toes, and lean in for another carefully selected case study for your delectation. And remember that as ever, we will launch a poll at the end of the Q&A to capture your feedback. It's now time for me to hand over to Stefan to take us into the world of sci-fi. Stefan, are you ready?
I absolutely am.
Perfect, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today. And as Tom has teed up for us very nicely, we're going to talk about how science fiction helps us get better at seeing the future. Now, obviously, this is par for the course for science fiction writers. This is what they do every day. And the way they do it is quite interesting. So we're going to think about how that can inform the work we do as marketers, as insights professionals, as strategists. And again, as Thomas said, we're going to share a bit of theory, we're going to show some tools, going to show some examples, and hopefully share some stuff that could be useful for you. Here's a picture of me looking beautiful, I'm sure you'll agree. My credentials for talking about this are twofold. As Tom has said, we do a lot of work with clients in the space of strategy and planning and translating insight into foresight and plans. So kind of professionally, it's something we do a lot of. And in a sense, all market research is trying to see into the future in one way or another. I guess the other sort of side of my credentials for this are a misspent youth watching and reading a lot of science fiction, some of which I'll be referring to as we go through here. For those of you who don't know us, we're an agency, at least normally based in London. There's about 100 of us. And again, as Tom has said, we do research, which is the part of the business I sit in, as well as planning and working with business owners and investors to develop and implement strategy. It's enough about me. Let's talk some more about Isaac Asimov. So he's one of the greats of science fiction. Also, as it happens, a bit of a creep, but that's not the topic for today. What we're going to talk about is this quote that Tom mentioned at the very start about the idea that it's easy in the late 1800s to predict the invention of the car, but quite hard to predict all of the downstream, secondary, non-obvious impacts that the car might have. So what he was saying there is if you're in a world where you've got horse-drawn carriages and steam trains and various other forms of locomotion and propulsion, it's not wildly difficult to predict that those things might come together and that the horseless carriage might be sort of quickly on the horizon. But of course, the impact of the car, the repercussions that the car had on society are far wider than transport. The car profoundly altered our culture and our way of life. In America, it created the suburb, the sort of defining social structure of the 20th century came about because people could then drive their cars to work. Similarly, it created, in some sense, the teenager. It gave young people in the 1950s a place to be themselves away from their parents, and everything that came with it, from sort of Chuck Berry to the sexual revolution, is in some sense predicated on that independence. And of course, it created traffic jams and all of the stuff that came with it. And it's probably not a huge surprise to think, why are we interested in unexpected consequences right now? And the reason, of course, is that we've been through a period that we're told again and again is unprecedented. We're going to talk in a bit about whether or not it truly is unprecedented. It probably isn't, but it's certainly been different. And there's been a heightened need to have a sense of what might be coming in the future, especially when some of those consequences are on their face, not directly obvious consequences of, a global health crisis. So, for example, plastic surgery businesses around the world reported an increase in the uptake of things like cosmetic surgery over the first few months of global lockdowns, because people knew that they were going to be away from their colleagues for weeks or maybe months, and they could recover in peace. That's not an immediate consequence of there being a new strain of respiratory disease. It's a sort of secondary, tertiary consequence of the fact that people weren't going into work. Similarly, Nintendo, the computer game manufacturer, had the hit of the year, one of the biggest selling computer games of all time, certainly the biggest selling computer game of 2020, with Animal Crossing. This is a game that had been in their roster for at least a decade and never been a huge seller. But what made it a huge success last year was that it took the social interactions that people couldn't have, trading, meeting people, befriending people, turned that into a game and then sold it back to people who are stuck indoors. And thirdly, the boom in cardboard sales as a consequence of everybody having to order everything online, the huge sort of growth of things like Amazon delivering stuff in cardboard boxes. That's not an immediate consequence of the pandemic, but it's a fairly direct secondary consequence of the things that the pandemic caused. Now, I'd imagine we're all kind of aware that predicting the future might be quite useful, but it's particularly seeing these non-obvious things that can constitute a competitive advantage. So as I'm sure you're all aware, Smurfit Kappa are one of the biggest cardboard manufacturing groups in the UK, listed on the stock exchange. And if you'd invested on the 23rd of March in cardboard, you'd have seen a 200% return on that investment by a few days ago when I took these numbers out. Now, all that's really saying is that it's a repetition of that point Isaac Asimov was saying. Lots of people saw that there were going to be big consequences of this pandemic. What was more difficult to see was what those secondary consequences might be. And the way in which we can do that is with something called system-based thinking. So this is an approach to problem solving, to describing the world, that has its roots in the early 20th century as a fairly sort of abstract, interdisciplinary academic pursuit. But it's really just the formal study of systems, of processes and groups of things that interact with each other. And it's related to the idea of cybernetics, which in itself sounds quite sci-fi, but really it's just a way of saying, imagine if this thing was a machine. So imagine this system was a machine with inputs and outputs and knobs and dials, and what happens if I press this button, and what happens if I turn that dial? And you can apply that to all sorts of things: the economy, society, a business, the processes within your business. And the sort of basic thought there is really just about thinking about secondary consequences. If this happens, then what? Then what? Then what? And it's contrasted with what we might call siloed or reductive thinking, where you stop at the first order effects. And this is where you do risk those unintended consequences or escalations. So a very simple kind of siloed, one at a time kind of reasoning would tell you, well, there's crop damage in my fields. The cause is the grasshopper. So the solution is kill all the grasshoppers. Now, sitting here as we do as well-informed ecologically minded citizens of the world in 2021, we can see that there may be some fairly severe unintended consequences of wiping out a whole class of living beings within an area. But that isn't obvious, and there's plenty of examples in history where we've done things like that because we've stopped at the first order effect of an action, because that immediately then informs the action that we want to do next without thinking about what the subsequent impact of that might be. And this idea that you need to think further than just the immediate consequence is actually really common. It shows up everywhere. It's kind of implicit in lots of the tools that we use as market researchers or as marketers. Marketing funnels, customer journeys, things like that, they are ways of trying to describe, in that case, consumer or shopper behavior in terms of a system that has kind of inputs and outputs. Similarly, I've mentioned ecology already, that idea of thinking of the world as a single whole living being, very sort of 60s, 70s sort of ecological movement way of thinking. But that again is based on, or comes from, this idea of thinking in terms of systems. Interconnectedness, the sort of yoga idea of we're all part of a single whole. Again, that's systems thinking in some sense. And the example that's up on screen here is a thing called the wiring diagram that was prepared in the mid-1970s for the then sort of not yet Tory government, looking at, from their point of view, what the problems were with the UK economy. And they did that in a system-based way. So they looked at the various interactions that they believed existed within the UK economy, policy levers, the symptoms and outcomes of what they saw, the legacy and sort of psychological factors within society, and tried to map them as if they were a machine, as if this were a circuit diagram for some rudimentary machine that describes the system of the UK economy. And if you zoom in here, it's not a brilliant scan, but hopefully you can read there, weak private sector. They highlighted that in red. That they saw as the sort of heart of all the problems that they could diagnose with the UK economy. And plugged right into it, this is created in 1974, 10 years before the miners' strikes, was union attitudes. Now, whether you agree or not with what they did, it very clearly was based on an analysis of the UK economy and how it worked. And a decade before these policies really came into action, they had created this system-based view of the world, and this was informing how they formed policy and how they would act in government. So that is one way you can do it. You can map a colossal, complicated system and spend years implementing it. That's kind of difficult, though. So the approach that science fiction writers take is quite different. So there's a quote here from H.G. Wells, author of War of the Worlds and lots of other things, where he says, when putting together a story, he allows himself one impossibility, just one. And what he's trying to do then is take that one impossibility, that one change, or that one possible future, that one possible change in the future in the terms we're talking about, and then see what the consequences of it are. He talks about domesticating the impossible. What he's saying there is go deep, don't go broad. And that's the way that lots of sci-fi is put together. So in War of the Worlds, granted it's quite a big one that he starts with, the impossibility is what if aliens invaded Woking, but he then follows that down in detail. He doesn't add 15 other things. So he looks at how the British Empire of the late 1890s might fight the invasion of Woking, and they have sort of battles with ironclad warships of the time. And if you remember, ultimately the aliens are defeated by the humble common cold, all because he's got this one central idea, and then he thinks, how might this play out in the world otherwise unchanged? Children of Men, if you're familiar with that book and that film, P.D. James, the question there is, what if there were a global fertility crisis? What might be the effect psychologically, economically on the world as it stands today? And Star Trek is kind of asking the question, what if a mid-century open plan office went into space? And you've got all of the details that people would recognize. You've got a secretary, you've got separate desks, you've got the CEO sat in the middle in his big chair, sort of waving his arms around and shouting at people. But it's one idea then thoroughly explored. So that idea of going deep rather than going broad is central to the way in which we think you can use science fiction thinking to go about predicting the future for yourself. So what I'm going to do now for the rest of the session is talk about 3 ways in which you might apply that, just 3 sort of thought starters for doing that. And I'll start with one inspired by a quote from Mark Twain, who, granted, isn't actually a sci-fi author, albeit one of his novels is about time travel, sort of. He says, "History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes." So the thought here is, if you're looking to ladder from a single change to what the consequences might be, have a look at similar changes in the past. So take COVID-19, for example. How might we redescribe that in different terms? Well, it's a public health crisis, it creates restricted mobility, it increases unemployment. Okay, you list all of those out. And then you take them in turn and you try and bottom out. And this is where you have to do your homework. You know, this isn't all sort of imagination. These are things you can research. What happened during the Spanish flu? How did governments and society respond to HIV/AIDS? What do we do each year for the seasonal flu? All of these things are powerful thought starters. They're ideas for where you could go looking for what those second order consequences might be. And it's all there. I mean, all of the things that we're seeing now, although we're told this is unprecedented, they all happened about 100 years ago with the Spanish flu. So open-faced sneezers to be arrested screamed a headline in the Chicago Tribune in 1918. All of the things you see on screen here, these are all kind of first-order consequences, but they already give you clues to where you might look for the knock-on effects of, in this case, COVID-19. These are not unprecedented times, and you can use things like this to sort of hunt down what the effects might be. Sci-fi technology number 2 is to look at disruptors. So William Gibson, famous sci-fi author, very popular in the 1980s, invented the idea of cyberpunk, author of Neuromancer, sort of first thinker of the internet before the internet was widely known. He said, "The future is here already. It's just not very evenly distributed." So what he's talking about there is the idea that if you look at the edges of society, if you look at the edges of technology, you're going to see things that will be widespread in 5 years' time, 10 years' time, even if they're not there now. And that could be a really powerful, different way to come at thinking of what these downstream consequences might be. To say, well, we see this business doing this kind of thing already, or we see this technology being adopted here. What will happen when that comes to my category? And that's a tool I'm sure you've used before in ideation sessions, you know, thinking about what would happen if a Tesla came into my category, a new technology being adopted, or what happens if a Lidl came into my category, a new business model being adopted. That's kind of bread and butter of a lot of ideation processes. But it's quite useful to think a bit more specifically and think in terms of the qualities that are important in your category or your industry. So in, I don't know, pharmaceuticals, for example, it might be that businesses are successful on their clarity and accuracy of information, on the convenience with which they deliver their products, on the efficacy of their product, and the degree to which they can personalize. So if you use the qualities that are important to your business or to your category or to your industry, and then think about who is disrupted in that space, that can get to a more specific way of thinking about these disruptions and picking examples that are relevant and thinking, well, what would be the secondary consequences of the kind of approaches that Uber or Gore-Tex or The Economist brought to their industries? And from there, the questions you ask, it doesn't really matter, but 3 we think are useful are sort of how do they reinvent the category? How do they attract and retain customers? So what's their sales technique and what's their communication technique? How do they talk about the category? So using, Uber as an example, if Uber came to pharmaceuticals, what might they do? Is it about hyper-local deliveries replacing the traditional pharmacist? Or is it an app that lets you shop for the cheapest available generic drug? None of this is sort of magic, but it's all useful stuff to think about what might happen. And then the third bit of technology to suggest is useful comes from this quote from Ursula K. Le Guin, that nobody who says "I told you so" has ever been or ever will be a hero. And really that's talking about sort of collaboration, humility. And where that came from for us was during the early days of COVID, we created within the wider business that I belong to, group called Kin and Carter. It's about 1,600 people all around the world. And it was fairly clear to us that no one person sat in the middle could have a clear view of what was happening and what might happen next. So we crowdsourced and collaborated on this, in this case, a shared Google Sheet. There was also a Slack channel, various other things, to put together, firstly, just observations, what we know about the virus and the global response on the left-hand side here. Then we tried to group them up, and then we tried from there to hypothesize what the new behaviors, what those secondary consequences might be. And the reasons that that's powerful are we've got people in different places who consume different media, who have different perspectives, different interests, different lives, different life stages, all of those things. It's wildly improbable you can have the depth and breadth of experience and imagination to see what those possible future outcomes might be. So when you're doing that laddering process of asking what next, what next, what next, it's really helpful to have as many people as possible working on that. And in fact, in this case, we opened up this sheet and made it open source. So we had our colleagues working on it, but also our clients working on it. So adding to it, reading from it, suggesting things, and trying to get as broad an idea as possible of what might be coming down the track. Okay, so I've rattled through 3 things there that are ways to implement the idea of system-based thinking, 3 ways in which you can ladder up from the immediate obvious consequences to the subsequent ones. Now, what you do with that is then probably a subject for a different session, because what this is going to give you is lots of possible futures, not one single future. Now, if you're an entrepreneur, if you're a startup business, that might be enough. One interesting thing that won't be sort of true in 5 years in a category can often be enough to inspire a whole new business. For the kind of organizations we work with, long-lived organizations, pre-existing organizations, it's probably more about reconciling and prioritizing what you think is most likely and putting it through the lens of what's most relevant to you. So if what's most relevant to you is, will this category go up or down? Well, there's lots of detail behind it, but actually if you put it through that lens, you can come to a very narrow, specific prediction without having to take a big bet on one thing being true or not. But broadly speaking, the idea is that you probably need to hedge. You need to consider what might the futures look like and be prepared for the things that seem most likely rather than putting all of your money on one. And similarly, you don't have to think of this as a one-off. It's an ongoing process of looking at what's happened, looking at what might still happen, and course correcting as you go. So I will now sum up, and again, there's lots in there, and we're going to be able to share some of these templates and slides afterwards if you want to revisit some of those specific tools. But the big thought we want to land is that competitive advantage comes from seeing those non-obvious future situations. That's the difficult thing and therefore the valuable thing. And to do this, we think thinking in systems is a really powerful way to get at what those might be. That means going deep rather than going broad, so being specific, being detailed. It means looking at historical precedents, at disruptive technologies and ideas, and collaborating to get as many of those as possible. And it means then reconciling, deciding, and course correcting, so not being tied to a single answer and not being tied to a single dogmatic view of what the future will look like. And that's all from me today. As I say, a real whistle-stop tour, but if there are any thoughts or questions, I'd be very happy to answer them. I'll maybe hand back to Tom for any questions he'd like to throw my way.
Super. Stefan, thank you very much. That's really interesting. It's great to move into the world of sci-fi every morning. We don't actually have any questions in the Q&A box at the moment, so I'll nudge our listeners to pop some questions in, and I'll ask a couple of questions of you, myself, Stefan, if I may. So often as we sit in the hot seat as heads of research functions and research buyers, we're responding to internal demand, meeting identified needs. I'm wondering where the natural start point is when it comes to the systems-based thinking and futures thinking. Are you mainly dealing with insight functions who are looking to create a grounding or a framework for the research that they do, or are you meeting the needs of internal departments? And if it is internal departments, which departments?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, the most recent engagements obviously were all sort of prompted by COVID, which were a fairly unusual set of requirements, and probably not in the day-to-day of an Incite department. But most typically, this is the kind of approach that you might deploy at the start of a annual brand planning process, actually. So it sort of sits between the two. It's not an immediate specific question often. It can be. We have done pieces of work which are a bit more focused. It's often more about the kind of situational analysis and broad category or consumer understanding that can go into those more foundational annual or biannual pieces of work.
Okay. Do you have some, I'm just wondering if you have some tips for influencing the C stream to actually, as a wake-up call, to get them to think about the need for this type of futures thinking?
I mean, I suppose where I'd start with that is probably a little bit of a cop-out, which is that it kind of depends on the personalities involved. But having said that, if we take as a stereotype that they're probably going to be most interested in the immediate commercial application of this and how it might drive the bottom line, I think it actually is about, I mentioned really briefly the idea of putting your futures through a single lens of, will this category go up or down? Will there be more or less mortgage lending in the next 12 months? If you have questions like that that are really foundational to the success of a business, lots of this work can then end up going through that aperture. And I think if you can find specific questions which are future facing but deeply commercial like that, then you can bring those two things together and you can bring the sort of wide, open, expansive thinking that this promotes into a more immediate commercial application.
Yeah, good response. It strikes me that this sits very comfortably with trends analysis and understanding of the key movements, and then moving from there into what could be and identifying the unexpected consequence. Okay, super, thank you. We've got some questions popping in here now, Stefan.
Excellent.
Bob Burgoyne is asking, what was the most interesting second or third order impact that came out of your crowdsourcing exercise?
Well, I have to say the plastic surgery one was one that I liked quite a bit. I think eagle-eyed viewers will have noticed on that sheet I popped up was that the increased demand for sex toys was something that we spotted quite early on and has proven to be the case, I'm told. So, there are a mix of the sort of salacious and more mundane in there, but that was probably one that caught my eye each time I opened that sheet.
I don't think we should slide from sci-fi into sex. Yeah, I love the way you chuckle before you give a response. It's really fun. Actually, as somebody from the financial services sector, I remember identifying that the biggest reason for loans in Brazil is for plastic surgery. And then some bright spark in the Scottish audience said that that'll never happen in Scotland because the Scots don't need it. Stretching the imagination a bit. Ruth. Hi, Ruth. Ruth Hinton's asking a question. Are there some non-obvious stakeholders in the business who we should think of including in such exercises who you've found are a surprising source of insight? It's a good question.
It's a really good question. And again, I'll give a slight cop-out answer before then giving a slightly more serious one. The slight cop-out is it's as much about personality and personal life as it is about function. So you'll find people in the depths of the finance department who are fascinatingly interested in some corner of culture or technology, no bearing on their day-to-day job, but they just happen to know. So actually probably going as wide as is feasible with the technologies and services available to you is probably what I'd suggest. All that being said, there are some really obvious places to look, like within your R&D team, within your media and comms team, people who are just exposed to different things, and that includes external media and comms agencies in particular, that their job partly is just keeping an eye on interesting stuff and bringing them into the process as much as anybody else can be super useful.
That's really interesting. Do you find, I mean, so often I've observed through the years that people kind of detach their personal lives from working lives and almost operate as if they're two different characters, personalities. Do you actively bring or seek to bring the personal into the equation?
Yes, we absolutely do, because I think although we all kind of try to pretend that we do that. None of us very good at it. The things that matter to us are always going to be the things that we're best informed about, most passionate about. And it's just as important in an exercise like this, which is sort of open and expansive, as it is in something like planning. The things that a brand team is going to be most energized and capable and interested and passionate about are the things that they are personally interested and passionate about. So it's absolutely vital that you engage that part of the, that 80% of human experience.
Absolutely, that's a great observation. Couple more questions coming in, Stefan. Kay Kotak is asking, at what point would you involve primary customer research? Customers need anchors, otherwise they use their own. Is there a risk that you use research too soon in the process? Would you want to create future propositions first? Gosh, this is testing. Goodness me.
Well, it's funnily enough, we had a debate just yesterday. I think one of my colleagues, Tom Berry, might even be on this call, about the role of data versus the role of hypothesizing in this kind of process. And he's very much of the view, actually, that sort of contrary to what I've been saying, that you need to be careful with hypothesizing too early in the process. I tend to think that primary research is probably a long way down the row in this kind of process. There's lots of need for evidence and data and clues and signals, but testing propositions too early in this process, because this is about looking at 3, 4, 5 years out, maybe. People don't know what they don't want until what they want until you've sort of had a chance to work it through. So we tend not to do a huge amount of primary research as part of this process, and clearly it has a role at some point, but it tends not to be where we'd start.
It's interesting. Wendy Gordon, in her most recent book, Mindframes, talks about the need to come up with the telling hypothesis first, rather than a scattergun approach to finding information, doing research. Sit down, utilize the internal capability, come up with the hypothesis or several hypotheses, and then investigate. So yeah, it's quite a debate subject that you alight upon there, really, Stefan. You're really talking about utilizing capabilities, investigating, having clarity of intent, really, and of the environment, and then moving from there into identifying how you would use the data scientists or how you would use primary research to fill any information gaps, I suspect.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't think it's a sort of strict waterfall, do the hypothesizing, then go for the data. I think there is a sort of iteration and collaboration needed there. But broadly speaking, I think particularly when you look further out than the sort of next 6 months, there's just such a plurality of things that could happen. And similarly, there's agency on the side of the business. It's not just what will happen and how will we respond, there's choices. So as much as anything, the process of looking into the future is looking at the futures we might want to create with the assets and capabilities and interests and passions that we have at our disposal.
Fascinating. Another question for you, Stefan. Laura Taljard. Hi, Laura. What do you find is the most engaging way of presenting this insight to stakeholders? I've tried creating videos that set a context of future scenarios, but keen to hear any other ideas.
I mean, videos, rich collateral like that, absolutely fantastic for this kind of thing. I think the other part of the equation, though, aside from what's the kind of best visual format or whatever it might be, is just interaction. So that collaborative piece towards the end isn't just a way of getting a breadth of opinion and diversity of inputs. It's also a really powerful way to get people to think about and engage with the material. So, you know, in normal times, workshopping this at a room with lots of bits of paper and post-it notes, as much as anything, is a communication tool, at least as much as it is a sort of substantive thinking tool. And finding ways to do that remotely and digitally are challenging, but by no means impossible. So I'd probably err on the side of saying, think interactive rather than only providing beautiful collateral, as valuable as that is.
Adopt a sci-fi storytelling mentality, no doubt.
Yes. Yeah, maybe that should have been my answer, a sort of 120-word pulp novel about Mars.
Maybe. Kat Bryant is asking, Good morning, Kat. Is asking if you go deep rather than broad, is there a danger of going down a rabbit hole and tying yourself to one possible future when maybe multiple other outcomes could also disrupt your business?
I think that's a fair comment. I think what we'd say is, I mean, as with most things, there's probably a degree of balance required. Going deep on a single thing is probably not the right thing to do for exactly the reasons that Kat said. Similarly, though, going after more than 2 or 3 things is probably quite difficult. And it comes back to what you said, Tom, about the sort of focus of the business. Picking which rabbit holes to pursue is probably quite important there. But it's unlikely you're going to come up with much of any real value. And I'm sure those people who sort of in the early days of COVID were asked to do things like this found quite quickly that you can come to the same conclusions as everybody else on a very wide set of questions quite quickly, but kind of so what? So I think maybe the sort of the balance is to do a first pass of lots of questions and then pick the ones that seem interesting and productive and valuable. Maybe that's the way to sort of balance those two.
Okay, so kind of a go broad and then go deep kind of
Maybe
approach.
so.
Yeah. Okay, let's go. At this point, Stefan, I'm going to ask Suzanne to launch the 1 minute poll so that our listeners can give us feedback in terms of how they found this morning's presentation. It's standard practice for us here at Aura. But whilst our listeners are completing that poll, I'll ask you a further question, if I may. I mean, some of our members may well have pots or budget attributed to futures investigation. There may be a play pot available, and many are fortunate enough to have that, but many don't. And so looking to actually stretch a budget to in the vernacular of the time to get more for less. What would you suggest to them? What's the natural start point to introduce this systems-based thinking to their organizations and gain traction?
Well, I think it maybe comes back to an earlier question about where this kind of plugs into the day-to-day operations of an Incite team. It's the kind of thing that I think is most naturally introduced as part of the general review of what we know and what we don't know that will often go into things like brand planning processes. So if you can introduce this, and they typically are sort of structured, process-driven exercises. If you can use this as part of the information gathering, situation analysis work at the start of that kind of process, that's probably a fairly soft introduction where you're not saying, let's go and find out about the future for its own sake. There's a kind of purpose attached to it, but it's an opportunity to use some of these, really laddering tools, which are in one way or another quite familiar to most people who've engaged with market research or used market research from Qual, for example. Introducing it at that stage is probably a sort of low cost, low disruption, but maybe high value way to do it.
Excellent, super, thank you, that's great guidance. I should think now everyone's really had time to complete I call it a 1 minute poll, but in actual fact this morning there's only one question, so it'll take a nanosecond for everybody to do. Stefan, that was super this morning. Thank you very much for joining us. Really enjoyed the presentation and the journey into sci-fi. And thank you to all our listeners for joining us this morning. It's great to have your company. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly did. And I'm sure that you're leaving here with some new ideas that you can put into practice and perhaps a new dimension to bring into your thinking to give broader context and resonate with your thinking and the requirements of your business. So the slides will be in the knowledge tab of the members section of the Aura website within the next 48 hours, probably within the next 24, to be honest. And also keep an eye on the Aura website for the next events coming up during March. We will have Stefan join us again in April, so we can look forward to that. But in the meantime, we are now at 9:40. I think it's time for everybody to get on with the day in prospect, which may involve homeschooling, I dare say. So until the next time, this is Tom Kerr saying goodbye on behalf of me and of Stefan, who has used live long and prosper, I see, the great old Star Trek expression on screen. So on behalf of us all here, have a good day. Goodbye for now.